Joining us for the conversation is Haitham Husseini, a former research fellow at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. And with us from Jerusalem is Professor Moshe Maoz, a professor emeritus of Islamic and Middle Eastern Studies at Hebrew University. Thank you both very much for being with us here on The Rundown. Moshe, let me start with you. We just looked back 40 years. Let's go to present day. How critical would you say the relationship with Egypt, one that we hear today is growing stronger and stronger? That's at least what the Israeli government says. How critical is that to Israel's relationship across the Arab world?
I think it's very critical in the sense that it was the Egyptian-Israeli peace treaty was a model for other peace treaties with Syria, which unfortunately never materialized, and especially with the Palestinians, because the Camp David Treaty left out in practice, not in theory, the Palestinian issue, especially the issue of Jerusalem. I mean, they were decided about autonomy, which was implemented in Oslo 25 years ago, again, not materialized, and the question of Jerusalem, as far as I recall, I was at the Knesset at the time when Sadat spoke, he demanded that Jerusalem, or East Jerusalem, the Temple Mount, will be under Islamic control, which again never materialized, and it's getting from bad to worse, and this could be a point of friction between Egypt and Israel now.
Hi, some 40 years after, we're still calling it the cold peace. The temperature rises and falls generally, but still, it's fair to say it's never reached the temperature that certainly Israelis like to see. So let's look at what positive can we say about the treaty, other than the fact that there has been no war between Israel and Egypt since then?
So 4 points. The first point regarding the current situation in Sinai, since the Egyptian revolution that took place 7 years ago, Egypt has been struggling with security situation in Sinai, and Israel and Egypt have been cooperating a lot when it came to this matter. Sharing intelligence, Israel is helping Egypt with fighting terrorism. The second point is regarding the gas deal that was just signed last January. It proved that the Egyptian government is willing to allow people from the private sector to deal with the Israeli side. And the most important point, which is number 3, the continuation of the qualifying industrial zones, which was a protocol that was signed 2004 between Egypt and Israel that allows Egypt to have free access to the American market through Israel. It employs 200,000 Egyptian workers, and it constitutes 45% of Egyptian exports to the American market, which comes through Israel. And the last point, tourism. Egypt has been struggling with the tourism sector, and because of the Israeli tourism that has been flocking, Jewish Israeli or Arab Israeli, the Egyptian tourism sector in Sinai, Sharm el-Sheikh, and surrounding areas has been surviving on that.
Interesting, because the economic side is not one that a lot of Israelis, except those directly involved with, even think about. And Moshe, on the diplomatic side, is there something that Israel could be doing more or better over the years or recently to, in a sense, try to extend this agreement, see more benefit out of it?
Certainly. And I want to remind all of us that the treaty has been between regimes, between states, not between people, unfortunately. Because we don't have cultural relations, we don't have human relations with Egypt, with other Arab states. And I think it's mostly because that the Palestinian issue has not been solved. The governments are cynical. They look after interests. The people are more emotional, more ideological, and they want the Palestinian treaty issue and the issue of Jerusalem being solved. So it can serve, as was discussed, as a model for other Arab countries, and this is what's happening, especially with Jordan and the Gulf states, maybe also Saudi Arabia. But again, it's a kind of a cold peace, not a deep-down peace.
Haitham, Moshe brings up a really important point, which is the people and the public. We talk about leaders. When Sadat and Begin met, it was maybe a match made in heaven in terms of leaders willing to take big steps and big strides forward. But the public is still always an obstacle, particularly the Egyptian public and the anti-Israel sentiment. How big of an obstacle is that to warming up the peace? And do you think that sentiment has actually changed?
I think the issue, yes, the public is a big obstacle for that, but the issue is the government itself. The government follows certain policies that makes the public all the time anti-Israel. And in my research, I identify 4 main points that makes the public all the time against Israel. One, TV shows that are sponsored by the government that defames Israel and Jews all the time. The second point is Egyptian tourism to Israel. While some Egyptians would like to come to Israel, but according to Egyptian security services, Israel is among the 16 countries in the world that Egyptians cannot travel to.
That's an Egyptian decision?
That's an Egyptian decision. So this is the big issue. The third point, education sector. You have 13 Hebrew departments all across Egyptian universities, and you have few thousands of Egyptians who graduate every year with degrees in Hebrew and Israel studies, and none of them are allowed to come here to Israel. And the last point is water cooperation. Egypt is struggling heavily with water, and Israel has proven and has a track record of solving such issues. So the question, would the Egyptian government be willing to do that? This is the question.
Moshe, we just heard a series of points of how Egypt, what steps they could take to improve relations. I want to ask you, recently Egypt complained that Israel is still giving out its warnings to travelers to go into Sinai, saying that in the southern Sinai, it is safe for Israel. Here's another example, perhaps, where Israel should be a little more sensitive, perhaps, of Egyptian concerns to try to work to build on its side to warm up those relations.
Yeah, certainly, you're right. No doubt about it. I remember there were times when Israelis and Egyptians met in Sinai, and also in Egypt and Israel. At the university, we hosted, from time to time, Egyptian scholars. There were writers who were coming, not any longer. So I think both countries don't encourage their citizens to visit other countries, especially Egypt, unfortunately. But Israelis are maybe concerned about it. They go to Sinai, but not to Egypt. It used to be Egypt is a great country, so amazing country, and not very many Israelis go to Egypt because of the tension, because they feel unwelcome. And the government in Egypt should do more. It has done quite a bit, no doubt about it, especially Abdel Fattah Sisi, but it's not sufficient. It should come also from the religious establishment.
Haitham, how feasible is that the religious establishment will come around?
Will come around.
Will come around to sort of a more rosy look at Israel in Egypt?
It will take time. And the regime nowadays has been struggling with that and has been trying to find more moderate voices that will come and speak up. And there have been some examples, actually, of some religious clerics who appeared on Egyptian television for the first time and said the word Israel is not a curse. It's a name of a prophet, and we have to appreciate it. So we started to hear positive trends in this regard.
Noted synagogue in Cairo was renovated, so there has been... It's baby steps, but there have been steps.
And some Egyptian Jews were allowed to return to Egypt recently to celebrate the Jewish New Year in an Egyptian Jewish synagogue, and it was publicly known and everybody knew about it. So this is also another positive trend.
Bottom line, 40 years ago, you had 2 brave leaders really coming together to start this cold peace, but you need the publics, you need the people to meet each other, to get to know each other, to maybe take it a step further.